Namaste, ladies and gentlemen. Today we're going to talk about the Indo-European language family, the homeland of the language family, and the non-linguistic evidence for the homeland. You see, mainly this is the story of languages, and therefore the linguistic evidence is quite important. However, other disciplines also have their importance, and we are now going to take them into account. The Indo-European language family was thought up by several people gradually, but was officially born in a lecture in 1786 by William Jones in Kolkata, where he posited the kinship between Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, Gothic, and his native language, which was Welsh. Fairly soon, people started speculating about where this language had originated. And so at the time, most people thought that Sanskrit was practically the original ancestral language. And so they located the homeland where they had found Sanskrit, which is in India. And a relatively enthusiastic and romantic book was written about it, Sprache und Weisheit der Indier, The Language and the Wisdom of the Indians, by Friedrich Schlegel in 1808. And so at that time, the out of India theory was dominant. People thought the language family had originated in India and had gone out of India and conquered Europe. And so that is the same language, even though it didn't have the name out of India theory yet. That has been revived since about 1990. It is in 1996 that the American student at the time, Edwin Bryant, who wrote his PhD thesis about the budding homeland controversy, dubbed the Indo-centric theory out of India theory, as an analogy to the out of Africa theory for the genesis of mankind that spread out of Africa across the world. But then it gradually gave way to, after 1820, to the Aryan Invasion Theory, or at least that's what it's called in India. From the Indian viewpoint, it looks like the Indo-European languages came in from outside. And so to Europeans, it seems that, well, they left Europe or Central Asia and went to India. And so that homeland could be Afghanistan, it could be Russia, it could be Germany. It was not Western Europe. They didn't go that far. It could have been Central Europe, Eastern Europe, the Balkans, Western Russia, Central Asia. So any of those, but since the 1920s, gradually the consensus has come about that the homeland was the Pontic steppe north of the Caspian Sea. And so that theory, that it implies whichever the westerly homeland is, implies at any rate that the language family had to have come into India by an invasion. So that's so-called Aryan Invasion Theory. In India, that is associated with Friedrich Max Müller, who wrote from Oxford, but who in fact was a German, and who used all the discoveries or the earlier theories thought up by German scholars. And so the heartland of Orientalism, of the study of Sanskrit especially, is Germany. And so that had nothing to do with the colonial enterprise. Germany had no colonies in Asia. But so he took that to England, made very sensational work, in fact. And so colonial administrators then saw the political use they could make of these theories. They thought that since the so-called Aryans, the Indo-Europeans, had moved into India and become more or less the Hindu or the upper caste population, that's what they thought, that therefore the British also could justify their own presence in India because they too had only invaded like the Indians themselves had done. So the Indians, in the British view, had no more right to India than the British. They were all invaders anyway. So that's the use that was later made of the Aryan Invasion Theory, but that's not the origin of the Aryan Invasion Theory. Some Indians say, oh, it was concocted by colonial conspirators and so on. That's not true at all. It was very innocently developed as a linguistic theory, and then later it was politically used. The entry into India was estimated at about 1500 BC. Now, in the early 20th century, the Harappan civilization was discovered. And its disappearance was timed to 1500 or a bit more, 1900 BC. But it seemed to fit the Aryan invasion. And so at first they thought, oh, it is the incoming Aryans who have destroyed the Harappan civilization. Then later that idea gave way to something else, namely that the Harappan civilization had collapsed through other circumstances, mainly desiccation of the soil. And then later the Aryans had come in and moved into a void, an emptiness that had been left behind by Harappans who had emigrated. Emigrated not so much to Europe, but to Western Asia. Mitanni in Syria, for example, has traces of Sanskrit, or to Eastern India. But so the Harappan area itself had more than enough space for a new population, and so that's where the Aryans moved in. That's what the theory became. Of course, there was a shift in accent. Originally, they thought that the Aryans had come into India and civilized it. Now, with the recognition that there was a native civilization, the scenario practically reversed. Then they thought, well, the civilization native to India was, if not destroyed, at least replaced by incoming barbarians, who later got civilized thanks to the civilizing influence of the natives. Who knows? You see, these were two scenarios, but they were both scenarios within the Aryan invasion theory. So that remained the scenario until recently. In 1982, K.D. Sethna, who was a secretary, or who had been a secretary of Sri Aurobindo, he published the book Karpasa. Karpasa means cotton, and it develops the idea that cotton, and then some other materials as well, are not present in the Rig Veda, but present in the Harappan civilization. We have archaeological traces of them. We know that the Harappans knew them, yet the Vedic people didn't know them. This, he thought, is only possible if the Vedic people lived before Harappa. Now, the Floruit, you see, the period when Harappa flourished was about 2600 BC to 1900 BC. So the Vedic people must have lived even earlier, 3000 BC. That is the theory he develops in some detail in his book. And that strongly revived the debate about the homeland. Suddenly Indians started to feel, hey, we've been thinking that we were invaders all the time. Actually, you see, we may be natives to India. The main center, which was now realized even more pressingly, had been the Saraswati River. Most of the Harappan cities, originally called the Indus civilization, were not on the Indus, but were more easterly, mainly in the Saraswati River basin. Only that river had dried up. It was only a small rivulet in Haryana, and then in Rajasthan it didn't exist anymore at all. It ran dead in the desert. So originally there was a big river there, described in the Vedas, and where effectively archaeologists have found many sites of ancient human habitation. So now a new scenario developed, perhaps best summarized by David Frawley's paradox. David Frawley observed that on the one hand, we had a big wealth of archaeologically attested cities with no literature. And on the other hand, we had a big literature, the Vedic literature, but with no corresponding archaeology. And they are situated in the same area and in roughly, we don't know exactly, but roughly the same time period. Would it not be logical to couple these two, to say that the literature of the Harappans, that's the Vedas, and the cities where the Vedic people lived, that's Harappa. So, more or less around that model, a new out of India theory developed, where the origin of Indo-European was India, and then it spread from India westwards. Interestingly, here is a number of astronomical proofs for the age of the Rig Veda. It turns out that the idea that the Aryans moved into India in 1500 BC and there started to compose the Vedas, that is untenable. You see, the Vedas are definitely Indian. There are many references to Indian mountains and rivers and typically Indian species of animals and plants. But to time the Vedas as younger than 1500 BC, that is untenable, because there are a number of astronomical references in the Vedas that can be easily deciphered, that can be easily timed, and so we find a number of post-Rig Vedic references in the Kaushitaki Brahmana, in the Atharva Veda, situate themselves around 2300 before Christ, which means that the Rig Veda was even older, maybe 3000. And then we have a definitely post-Vedic book, the Vedanga Jyotisha, which is an auxiliary book to the Vedas written after the Vedic literature had been completed. And that times itself twice and independently to about 1350 BC. So that's already post-Vedic, at a time when, according to the Aryan Invasion Theory, the Vedas were only just beginning. So in fact, we should time the Vedas a lot earlier. And then they largely overlap with the Harappan period. And then, of course, there is no question anymore of an Aryan invasion, or it would have to be much, much earlier. After all, we know that the Indian population ultimately came from Africa, so there may have been some migrations, why not? But at any rate, it is not the Aryan invasion of which people speak when they try to explain the spread of Indo-European. Note also that these astronomical references all point to a higher chronology, that they are mutually consistent. So it's not that these ancient primitives just wrote anything. No, you see, it is very consistent. For example, when we know of two books that they are in sequence, like for instance, in the second book they write about my ancestor, and he is one of the people who wrote the earlier book. Then we know, you see, there is a sequence between those books. Well, the sequence between the astronomical references in those books will match it. The younger book, literarily, will have younger astronomical references, not the other way around. So there is no confusion, there is no chaos in these astronomical references. They really make sense. And another thing important is that there is not a single astronomical reference that supports the Aryan invasion theory. Not one. Then there is the archaeological evidence. Now, of course, I know that pottery and all the things that archaeologists find, they don't speak. So, strictly speaking, you don't know whether these were Aryans or Dravidians or anything else. But nevertheless, what you do see is that there was a complete continuity in the Harappan cities before, during, and after the urban phase. You have the same population, the same culture, the same type of clothes, the same kind of habits, insofar as you can identify them. And there is no trace of an influx. There is also not a new racial type, to use the old terminology. So this is very strange, at least if you believe in the Aryan invasion theory. You see, we find no trace of an Aryan invasion. B.B. Lal, the famous archaeologist, now I think 96 years old, is sometimes quoted in Aryan invasion literature as having proved the Aryan invasion. Indeed, that is how I first heard his name. It is as a student that I heard from Professor Pierre Egermont, a famous Indologist, that B.B. Lal has proven the Aryan invasion theory because he has identified the painted gray ware as typical of the Aryans moving deeper into India. Now, in the 1950s, as a young archaeologist, when he was making his name, he did study the painted gray ware, and he coupled that with what he had learned about an Aryan invasion. This much is true. However, it is not true that he had independently proven the Aryan invasion. On the contrary, he had assumed the Aryan invasion and then fitted his findings into it. But later he had realized that, in fact, he had merely applied the Aryan invasion theory to his findings. He had not at all supported it or proven it. And so now, and already for some decades, he says very explicitly, the Harappans and the Vedic people are two sides of the same coin. So now he explicitly, and equipped with all his archaeological knowledge, denies and refutes the Aryan invasion theory. Yet people who don't know that still cite his early findings as proof of the Aryan invasion. Now, at this point, some invasionists start some special pleading. They say, yeah, but something special may have happened. The Aryans may have come in under the radar in some way that we don't notice. They compare this, for example, with the entry of the Goths, the Germanic people, in Italy at the end of the Roman Empire. Now, this is an interesting comparison, because it is true that when the barbarians, so to speak, came into the Roman Empire and gradually conquered it, this made no great archaeological difference. You can't pinpoint, you see, this is Gothic, whereas this is native Roman. They simply came in and took over Roman culture. They became Romans. Now, linguistically, interestingly, they dropped their own language, and linguistically too they became Romans. Modern Italian is not very different from ancient Roman or ancient Latin. A few words, you see, were borrowed by Latin from Germanic, like the names of the directions. North, south, east, west. Those terms were taken over. Some military terms, for example, like the names of the directions are important for organizing a battlefield and so on. Or for example, the name of hallebarde, alabarde in French, is a specific weapon. Or a fortification, a bulwark, is in French called a boulevard, which comes from Dutch bulwark, which means a fortification. So a number of military terms were taken over from Germanic. You can see that the Romans had been conquered at some point if you analyze their language, but nevertheless, essentially, Italy and the whole Roman territory remained itself linguistically. So the invaders assimilated. Now, if you want to use that model as a model for what happened in India, then you precisely get the out of India theory, or at least you get a denial of the Aryan Invasion Theory. Because if there had been such an invasion under the radar, well, then the invaders linguistically assimilated. So they did not bring their own language. They did not impose their own Aryan language on India. And so if the Aryan language exists in India in the form of Sanskrit, it must have been native. Then there is the genetic evidence. So in India they make a lot of it. They say that the geneticists have proven the Aryan Invasion Theory. They have done no such thing. They have proven that some migrations into India have taken place. But we knew all that. We knew that the Scythians had come in and the Greeks had come in and the Tocharians or Kushanas and the Turks, and then some refugee populations came in, the Parsis, the Syrian Christians. Even Ethiopians have come in as slave soldiers. They are now the Sidi caste in Gujarat, on the coast. But you see, all those populations have assimilated. Not one of them has imposed or even retained its own language. So this is not proof for the Aryan Invasion Theory. This is just proof that migrations have taken place, but that is nothing new. That we knew already. Then you have textual evidence. Now this is a discovery by Shrikant Talageri, and I really want to make you understand how important, how revolutionary this is. So far, nobody thought that there was any literary evidence about the fragmentation of Proto-Indo-European. They thought, oh, it is long ago, it happened before writing came about, so there is no writing about it. There's no writing describing it. Well, there is. At least that is what Talageri argues, and in my opinion, very convincingly. He shows that the Rig Veda, the oldest writing in India, originally not even written, it was orally composed and learned by heart, that contains testimonies of, let us say, a second part of the emigration. And it contains a memory of the first part of the emigration. You see, in the very first layers of the Rig Veda, you get the banishment or the forced emigration of the Drugyu tribe. So that may have been the first, or at any rate an early part, of emigration from the homeland. And maybe these Drugyus are the ancestors of the Celtic, Italic, Germanic populations. Then deeper in the Rig Veda, you get a description of conflict with the Iranians and ultimately also their forced emigration. They relocate to Afghanistan. They remain in contact with the Vedic people for many generations. But at any rate, they have left India. They originate in India. They are described as an Indian tribe that left India. Now that is a sensational discovery. And so all that I've said about archaeological evidence, genetic evidence, and so on, it's all very interesting. You know, a lifetime can be filled with it. But ultimately, it is all very poor compared to literary evidence. Now, this is human evidence. To start interpreting genes or to start interpreting pottery is a difficult task. I mean, I don't envy these archaeologists, you know, who go dig and dig in the hot sun and then find pieces of stone, pieces of pottery, and then have to interpret all this. You know, it's very difficult, and even then, you know, no matter how convincing your interpretation, you're still not sure. And it would be so easy to have this same history just described by human testimony. Now, nobody had dared to hope that this could be the case with the fragmentation of Proto-Indo-European. But Talageri shows that the Rig Veda does just that. Of course, it does many other things. It is not all about this history, but there are fragments within the Rig Veda that serve as eyewitness testimony to phases of the dispersal of Indo-European. So that is quite sensational. A few examples. In the Rig Veda, there is a layeredness. There are old parts and middle parts and younger parts of the Rig Veda that are well known. They were all already known to some extent, and in the 19th century, a German scholar, Hermann Oldenberg, gave a lot more detail. And so it's mainly on his findings that, on his uncontroversial findings, that Talageri has elaborated. And so then he shows the implications of this layeredness. He shows how these different layers describe different parts of India and different stages of civilization. For example, you have a technological gradient. In the old parts, only carts are described. Carts that are very useful. You can transport either grain or you can transport people with them. You know, they're very useful if you're going to migrate. But they're slow. And so a later development from these cars is chariots, where you can have races, or that you can use on a battlefield, as Arjuna and Krishna do in the Mahabharata. So that changeover from pre-chariot to chariot time, that is described in the Rig Veda. But you see, even more decisive is the geographical shifts that you see. In the old layers of the Rig Veda, you find that they're centered on the Saraswati and east of it, the Yamuna and even the Ganga, that the Ganga is described as a territory fully known to them. Then you see they settle along the Saraswati River. This becomes the cradle of their civilization. And then they worship the Saraswati as a mother. But then they keep on expanding westwards. And then you have a battle in West Punjab, the Battle of the 10 Kings, which they win. And they expand even further west into Afghanistan. Then you have another battle, the Varshagira battle, which they do not convincingly win. But at any rate, that battle brings them deep into Afghanistan. So they are expanding westwards, very clearly. Moreover, some populations are even driven west. That is all described. And so they leave India and they set up kingdoms there. This is all said in so many words. Like you have a Druhyu chieftain, Gandhara, who founds the city Gandhara. And so this gradient is really there. Pre-Vedic, centered in Uttar Pradesh. Vedic or early Vedic centered in Haryana on the Saraswati River. Then later Vedic, West Punjab, Afghanistan. So you have pieces of a description of the departure of several tribes from India. Then in the Avesta, you moreover get a description of how the Iranians, then settled in Afghanistan, had originally come from India, from Kashmir and Punjab, then gone to Afghanistan. And then you see the areas where they are familiar, they are all the parts of Afghanistan or just north of it. And then only from there they move into Iran, but that also happens later. Even the character of Vishtaspa is mentioned in the Rig Veda as well as in the Avesta, and a battle in which he takes part is described in both sources. This is very exceptional. In ancient history, you find an event described by different parties to the event, giving their own version. It's very exceptional. So this is what you have. I mean, nobody had thought it. And it's not the purpose of the Rig Veda to describe history, but offhand, things happen and they get described. And so we do have enough history to reconstruct at least this early part of the expansion of Indo-European. Okay, then another type of evidence, comparative mythology. You see, when you compare the myths of the world, you see that certain themes are common to the Indo-European languages and even to other languages. For example, the division in three colors, the three gunas, as they say in Sanskrit, the three properties, are symbolized by a color. The slow, inertial tendency is symbolized by black, the energetic, passionate tendency by red, and the calm and quiet and wise tendency by white. This color scheme is fully present in the Indian Sankhya philosophy. But we find traces of it in the Edda, the Germanic sacred book, where the upper class, the Jarls, is described as white-haired. In that part of the world, they have different kinds of hair color. Just like in India, you have different kinds of skin color. And then in that story, the middle class, the Karls, the free men, are described as red-haired. And the Thriles, the serfs, are described as black-haired. This same color scheme is found in India. You see, the Brahmins, the priests, have a symbol color white. The warriors have as a symbol color red, and the workers have as a symbol color black. This is even found in a Turkish myth, but no details further. But I mean that is an old myth that is found in many parts of the world. Similarly, the dragon slayer. And there is also a Turkish myth about the dragon slayer. In Indo-European, it is all over the place. You see, Zeus, the Greek thunder god does it. Siegfried, the son of the Germanic thunder god, does it. And then Indra in India does it. So dragon slaying is a favorite pastime of thunder gods all over the place. Then the creation of the world by a giant or an original man, a primeval man, the Purusha he's called in the Veda, being divided into pieces, and these pieces becoming the parts of the universe. His skull becomes the heavenly vault. His eyes become the sun and the moon. His hair becomes the vegetation. His bones become the mountains and so on. So this idea that the universe is an organic whole stemming from the organic whole of a body. Then the idea that society likewise comes from a body and the parts of society are related to one another like the parts of a body. This is a common myth. It is there in the Purusha Sukta, but it is also there in China in the myth of Pangu. It is there in the Roman administrator Menenius Agrippa. He gave this story likening society to the parts of a body. It is there in Saint Paul, in the New Testament even. So it is all over the place. Okay, so you have a very meaningful discipline of comparative mythology. Now let's apply this. It is interesting to see, for example, that you find the same motive in a number of myths, like the fact that a hero, when he's still a child, he is taken by his mother to some treatment that is supposed to make him invulnerable. You see it with Duryodhana, you see it in Greece with Achilles, you see it in Germany with Balder. You see, they are dipped into some fluid that makes them invulnerable. Unfortunately, the mother holds them at some place in their body, their heel, for example. So Achilles is invulnerable except for his heel. And so ultimately he gets killed by a shot in the heel. And likewise, Balder is invulnerable except for his shoulder, and he's killed by a shot in the shoulder. And Duryodhana is invulnerable except for his thigh, and he is killed by a blow to the thigh. So this is a common motive that you find back in Indian myths, in Scandinavian myths, in Greek myths. And so there are very many parallels. If you hold Homer together with the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, you find dozens of parallels. Now, some of these parallels are very interesting. They teach us something very important. And this is where Nick Allen comes in. Nick Allen is a scholar from England, from Oxford, I believe. I met him a few times. And so he's one of those numerous scholars in the West who believe in the Aryan Invasion Theory, who don't care about it, who have never investigated it. But, you know, for as far as they know, the Aryan invasion is a given fact. And so they don't realize it when they actually send out findings that ultimately support the out of India theory. And so those findings are in fact the most interesting. When you know for very sure this man was not trying to prove the out of India theory, yet that is exactly what he has done. So this is a case like that. Listen. He gives a number of several dozen parallels between the Mahabharata and the Odyssey by Homer. For example, at one point, Arjuna goes to a heavenly abode in the Himalaya and then ultimately on to Indra's heavenly city. And similarly, Ulysses, he goes to a blissful paradise-like island. So far, these two are parallel, but a difference is that in Arjuna's journey, it is a yogic undertaking. He himself is putting himself through a number of ascetic tests, whereas Ulysses is also put through a number of tests, but there they are things that are done autonomously by a god, Poseidon, to him. There is no yogic dimension to it. And so similarly, you get a number of parallels where the Indian version has this yogic dimension, whereas the Greek version does not. Now, yoga is something rather specifically Indian. There are traces of yoga in China, but that is not in play here. In Greece, you find a few traits of yoga in Pythagorean philosophy, later in Stoic philosophy. But it's marginal, and at any rate, in this particular episode, you do not have that yogic element. And anyway, it is also said that Pythagoras had it from India. So you see, yoga may, even in his case, have come recently from India. So in Greece, you see, this yogic element is marginal and is perhaps not native. They had long forgotten about it. Now, if nevertheless these Greek myths have parallels to Indian myths, minus the yogic dimension, well, it means they have a common origin, but something happened. And this is the account that Nick Allen gives. So either the proto-journey, the one that comes before the later version with either Arjuna or Ulysses. So the proto-German journey was like the Greek version, which means non-yogic. And in that case, in the Sanskrit version, the yogic dimension has been added. Or conversely, it was like the Sanskrit version, like Arjuna's version, which was proto-yogic, which had a yogic dimension, and then Greek tradition lost this yogic aspect. These are two possibilities. So Nick Allen says, I will argue for the second scenario, claiming both that the proto-narrative, the original Indo-European narrative, shared certain features with yoga, that the telling of such a story makes it likely that there already existed ritual practices ancestral to yoga in the original Indo-European myth, and that the later Greek version of that myth had lost this yogic dimension. So the Indian version is the original one. Now again, this doesn't prove India is the homeland. It is still somewhat possible that the original version lived in Russia and that they took it to India and somehow they preserved it entirely intact with its yogic dimension, whereas for some reason the Greeks lost it. But it is far more likely to say India was the homeland. In the stable circumstances of living in India, the Indians managed to retain the original full yogic dimension of the story, whereas the Greeks, in the rough and tumble of their migration, they lost the most precious element. Because the most precious element is what gets lost the easiest. If a body decays, you will see that the brain is gone in no time, whereas the bones will last for centuries. So similarly in this story, the most precious part gets lost, whereas the outer, the bones of the story, the skeleton of the story lives on. Yes, then you have the scriptural evidence. We already went through that. Yes, and then there is another aspect that might have some relevance here. In the Aryan invasion story, you usually get an extra element evaluating both the invaders and the natives. And this story is as follows, and it is very simple. Any child can understand it. It goes like this. The natives are good, they are egalitarian, they're peaceful, they're matriarchal, and they're native. They're Dravidian. And then you have the ugly, vicious, disgusting Aryan invaders. They are patriarchal, warlike, hierarchical, anti-egalitarian, pro-apartheid, imposing caste apartheid, and they brought the Vedas and Sanskrit. That's roughly the narrative that goes with the Aryan Invasion Theory. Now, and then it is explained that if there is anything good in Indian culture and in Sanskrit sources, it must be the influence of the natives. You see, somehow native culture, even though long suppressed by the ugly, vicious Aryans, lived on and gradually came back. And so medieval Tantra, which is nice, you see, this is, this is not oppressive, this is erotic and nice and egalitarian and matriarchal and so on, good, politically correct. And so, you see, that is the native culture that reasserted itself even under the formal dominance of the incoming Aryans. Now, even David Gordon White, who is a researcher on the history of yoga, and who is not liked in India, who is deemed anti-Hindu, who minimizes and who, doesn't take the Indian contribution seriously. Nevertheless, he says, I find no trace of this dichotomy. On the contrary, everything that is important in Tantra, I find it back in Vedic literature. And so, yeah, there were some differences of accent or different language to express themselves. Of course, there's 2,000-3,000 years between the Vedas and the Tantras. Of course, some differences had crept in. But essentially, there's a full continuity. It's the same terminology that is applied. Like, say, for instance, Abhinava Gupta, famous for Kashmiri Shaivism, worshipped by all these tantrics nowadays. Well, you see, he was very punctilious about caste and about upholding Vedic norms and living according to the Shastras. He was an ugly, vicious, patriarchal Aryan, which is why he was a Brahmin, for example. Nevertheless, he also practiced the culture that, is venerated and welcomed as a, hey, nice, matriarchal. So you see, this is a completely fake dichotomy. You see, the Vedic culture, Tantric culture, the local tribal cultures and so on, they are all not very different from each other. And of course, they have a patriarchal and a matriarchal element, and they have something warlike and something peaceful. So that's nothing special. Or for instance, in religion, they have something ascetic and they have something worldly, making charms in order to win certain favors, to win the battle or to win the heart of a woman or to win riches. That's worldly. But then you also have an ascetic trait, you see, where you don't want worldly riches, where instead you want liberation. Both elements are present in the Vedas. Already in one of the early Vedic hymns, the riddle hymn by Dirghatamas, you have the famous description of two birds, one of them eating berries and the other just sitting on his branch and looking on. So you both have the worldly tendency and the renunciate tendency already since the beginning of the Veda. And so it is just there throughout Indian culture, and so there's nothing contrast between native Tantra and invading Aryanism. So this is just not there. In fact, I could summarize it with a hymn from the Vedas itself. O Prithvi. Prithvi means the broad one, which means the earth. Thy center and thy navel, all forces that have issued from thy body, set us amid those forces, breathe upon us. I am the son of the earth. Earth is my mother. Look, isn't that tantric? Isn't that matriarchal? Is that Mother Earth? Nevertheless, the next verse says, Parjanya, who is the rain god, the thunder god in heaven, the sky god. Parjanya is my father. May he promote me. So there is absolutely nothing antagonistic. You see, a son of Mother Earth, a son of Father Sky. What's the problem? Or, there is a pacifistic and a socialistic element even, an egalitarian element in the Veda. The next verse says, Thine, Prithvi, are these 5 human races, for whom, though mortal, Surya, the sun, as he rises, spreads with his rays the light that is immortal. So the sun shines on everybody. The earth bears everybody. You see, this is Vedic socialism, as Swami Agnivesh calls it. Vedic socialism. You see, this emphasizes not caste apartheid. No, this emphasizes the sameness of all creatures. So they are somewhat different and somewhat the same. Isn't that what we all know all the time already? And so this whole Aryan invasion theory and the worldview that comes from it is all so artificial. You see, pitting tribals against non-tribals, pitting Dravidians against Indo-European speakers, and so on. Let us do away with all of this. Let us go back to the obvious. And so we can conclude it is a misconception that linguistics entails the Aryan invasion theory. It can be made to support the out of India theory. Let us stop thinking that genetics has proven the Aryan invasion theory, that archaeology has proven it, that comparative mythology has proven it. No, rather, they tend to support the out of India theory. And an even stronger source of evidence would be literary evidence, actual descriptions of what happened. And thanks to Shrikant Talageri, we now know that the Rig Veda contains enough of that description. So we even have human testimony showing that India was very probably the homeland of Indo-European. Now, that need not say anything, nothing need follow of it. Maybe this is just an interesting snippet of knowledge. It's an interesting thing to, during parlor conversations, to liven them up a little bit. You can come across as very witty by saying, oh, I heard that the Aryans did not come from Russia, they are native to India. Well, that's all very interesting. It need not be very important. Some countries are proud that they are the result of an immigration. Like, for instance, America. You see, the Americans celebrate Columbus Day, you see, and they celebrate the Pilgrim Fathers and the Mayflower. And so they are proud of having immigrated. Well, Indians perhaps feel more like not having immigrated. But ultimately, I don't think it is important. Even if the Aryans had invaded, they are still here for the last 3,000–4,000 years, which I think is enough to be counted as native. So it need not be very important, but very probably it is nevertheless nice to know that Indo-European, Sanskrit in particular, originated in India itself rather than having immigrated. Thank you.